So the PMBOK guide, if you download it, you will see that it is organized a little bit differently than the previous editions. You will get, if you get the paper copy, you will get a very thick book. We, several years ago, identified to PMI that it was starting to look like a doorstop. Well, it's an even bigger doorstop now. If you get the electronic guide, you will get the same thing, and it may take you a bit to figure out what they did. So we'll talk a little bit about the organization of the PMBOK guide, and then I'll get into the changes to knowledge areas and processes. One of the biggest change that has been made is an expansion of the project management role, an expansion of the discussion on the actual role hasn't changed, well, maybe a little bit, but the expansion of the role of the discussion around the role of the project manager and competencies. There's a huge discussion globally as to whether competencies of a project manager should be standardized. I find that a real hard discussion to be supportive of, but nonetheless it is happening, and you will see how they handled it in the PMBOK, and some of it might indeed be good. We'll talk about the glossary a little bit and what they've done there, the context of project management, and I'll finish off with tips for PMP and CAPM exam preparation. I'll try and maintain the timeline. If you have questions, please use the chat line and record your questions there. I will answer them either at the very end or as I go along if I see they're relevant to the slide, depending how much I'm paying attention to. You end up being sort of trying to figure out which screen to look at. I've got two screens going plus this webinar thing going, so excuse me if I miss something. But do try and type in your questions and I'll see what I can about answering them at the end of the session. Okay, so the organization of the PMBOK guide, as I mentioned, it's a lot bigger. You may notice that if you buy a printed copy on Amazon, it's now well over $100. If you're a member of PMI, it's over $50. They take a while to ship. So if you want a paper copy and you need it for a certain time frame, make sure you leave it for 6 weeks is at this point their turnaround time minimum. So it's easier to download the electronic copy. The electronic copy at this point isn't great. It's not bookmarked or anything. I'm sure they'll fix it. I meant to do it at the beginning of this month to see if anything's changed. Haven't gotten around to it. I'm sure they will eventually bookmark it. And the good thing is if you're a member, you can do that at any time. So you will get 3 books in one. The first book is a guide to the project management body of knowledge, the book that we all know and love, along with the glossary and appendices. The appendices are rather interesting. There is an appendix on Agile, so those of us who are wondering whether Agile is relevant to our industry might take a look at that appendix and see, well, are there concepts in here I can bring in? We're always talking about it in construction. I don't think we've entirely figured out how that works in our environment, construction and engineering. There is an appendix that summarizes key concepts of each knowledge area, very useful if you're talking to executives, if you're studying for the exam. The PMBOK in this edition has really emphasized tailoring considerations. Those of you who are studying for the exam, I wouldn't be surprised if you do get questions like that on the exam with regards to understanding how to tailor the process for the particular environment. Because there was this sort of thought process that gosh, we should use everything. There's a reason behind that too, which we'll talk about in 2 seconds. And then there's an appendix on tools and techniques, which is kind of handy because they've done some things to tools and techniques, and it can get rather confusing if you're navigating through the PMBOK trying to understand all of them, particularly if you're studying for the exam. The glossary, as always, is there. What they've done this year is align the glossary to the other standards, making sure the language is the same in the other foundational standards, namely the standard for portfolio management, the standard for program management. The second book in there is a standard for project management. Some of you may have heard that in November of last year, the US government actually endorsed the program management standard and the project management standard from PMI as the standards to use for federally funded projects. So as such, it's pretty hard to use the PMBOK guide as we know it as a standard. So what they've done is they created a standard. Now, some of you may recognize the document because it was previously an appendix, an annex in the previous PMBOK. So they brought it into the body of the PMBOK. It doesn't include tools and techniques, it just includes inputs and outputs, and is basically a summary of the PMBOK. There's a few little tidbits in there that are different than the PMBOK, but they are very few and far between. They might be handy again for studying for the PMP exam. The standard might be handy, but it's also useful if you're creating a project management framework. Our consistent argument with the PMBOK was all these huge lists of tools and techniques. And at the same time, these lists of tools and techniques were rather limiting because we're constantly coming up with new ones. So how can you say that these are the only ones? So the standard kind of gets away from that discussion and says, okay, these are the inputs, these are the outputs, and the tools and techniques essentially become part of what you use in your organization. The pick list starting point is in the PMBOK, but it's not mandatory that you use them in your framework if you have to comply with the standard for any reason. There's also an agile practice guide that comes with the PMBOK. There's huge discussion whether agile should be part of the PMBOK knowledge or not. This was kind of a compromise that they reached. They added it as a practice guide. So what has changed? Any questions so far, incidentally? Is anybody raising their hand? No, you can also raise your hand, by the way, but I might not respond right away because I'm thinking about time as well. So what's changed? In terms of processes, it's still the same 10 knowledge areas. We have one important new process, manage project knowledge. So that's all about lessons learned. The PMBOK gave too much of an impression that we gather lessons learned at the end of the project and then they disappear into a black hole. It's a constant discussion in the global community about how do we really embed lessons learned in our organizations. And so PMBOK has now covered that gap by embedding managed project knowledge as an execution process. The other new process is control resources. So resource management as a whole has changed. Instead of being focused only on human resources, it's all resources for a project. And as such, we have a new process called control resources. We also have a new process called implement risk responses. So the same processes in planning. I'm going to wander over here with my mouse. The same processes in planning, but now we have implement risk responses and we talk about monitoring risks as opposed to controlling risk, the approach being that we can't really control risks, we can only monitor and respond to them. And the reason implement risk responses is in here is the philosophy behind that was that we actually may be implementing risk responses at all different points in the project. Some of them even in the planning phase. Make sure you understand the difference still between process groups and life cycle phases. That we may, as a result of the risk analysis, actually have risk responses that we want to implement at various points in our project life cycle. And it's an execution process. It's a doing process. You will also may notice that in procurement management, the process closed procurement has disappeared. So closed procurements is now part of control procurements. It's an output of control procurements, closed contracts. Closed procurements, actually, they call it. I should maintain the same language. The other thing you might have noticed is this is no longer called time management, it's called schedule management, a change that was a long time coming. Otherwise, that's pretty well it. Now, sorry, and now I have to get back over here to change. There we go. I think. Come on, there we go. So philosophy for changes. Yes, as always, they took all the comments from the last edition that were deferred. They went through them and they updated the PMBOK in accordance to those deferred comments. They are still striving towards consistency. So as I mentioned, they want to have the same lexicon of terms in all foundational standards. And you can download their lexicon from the link shown on your screen. They also made an even greater effort to align and harmonize with ISO 21500. And some of you may know that the ISO 21500 standard is the standard that was produced by ISO as sort of, we hope that it's kind of the overarching standard for all project management standards around the world. And it's a little short one. It does not go as deep as PMBOK. It was never intended to do so, but basically to try to align the language and the processes for project management globally as opposed to just in a particular geographical area. There's also more information reflecting PMI's role delineation study for project managers that was done a couple of years ago and when they did their last exam change. They are continuing along the path of the DIKW model, namely gathering data, collecting it all up in information, and talking about it in terms of knowledge. But this, in the past PMBOKs, there's always a discussion when developing standards as to whether we should reflect what's actually going on in the discipline, or should we talk about what we consider best practices as practitioners, or should we also scan to the future as to what should be best practices from the experiences of practitioners and how projects are being managed today. So this version of the PMBOK has actually done that leap a little bit more than in the past. There are certain discussions of future work and the agile concepts and so on and so forth. So you will notice that as well, that there is some discussion about the future. And as such, it might be useful if you're very familiar with the PMBOK, you've got your PMP and you have no intentions of writing it ever again, I might suggest that you might think about at least looking at the beginning of each chapter in terms of what they talk about as trends for the future. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. ISO 21500. There are a number of standards that are global standards in project management. It's a bit of an issue actually, because a lot of standards at ISO talk about project management, and there's an issue of harmonization even at that level. ISO 10006, Quality Management Systems, just published an update. I should have actually changed that date. Oops, sorry, missed that. They just published an update this year, Guidelines for Quality Management in Projects. So that was just out. I have not looked at it, but there were people from the ISO 21500 committee on that 10006. In fact, I think the chair was one of the leading participants in ISO 21500, Monsieur Severin. And so I think that there was, in the past, there was very little connectivity between the two standards. Now there is more alignment between those two. If you go and look at ISO 21500, you will see that 38 out of 39 processes now have direct equivalents in the PMBOK guide. Not always the same language, exactly the same language, but the processes are there. PMBOK went a little bit further, and as I mentioned, a number of two processes have been moved between PMBOK guide knowledge areas. So high-level PMBOK guide changes. We have those new processes. You will see process name changes. Those of you who are studying for the exam and don't know whether they're going to take it this year or next year or after. By the way, the exam is changing March 26th. I'm terrible about remembering dates, but I just looked at it yesterday, but I believe it's March 26th. So if you don't have time to take the exam, the sea change to the processes is not that huge, so it shouldn't take you that much effort to get up to speed. What's really changed is the tools and techniques and the first 3 chapters. We'll talk about the first 3 chapters in a couple of minutes as well. Process name changes, no longer control, but rather monitor for communications, risk, and stakeholder management. Knowledge area name changes, human resources to resource management. Estimate activity resources have been moved to resource management. Closed procurements, we already talked about that, as an output of controlled procurements. No more closed procurement process. The ITOs, you will see in the previous PMBOK there was a little bit of inconsistency. In some of the processes it said project management plan, And another process that went to a huge detail, remember time management in particular, huge detail list of all the inputs to some of the processes. So now that has been smoothed out. The inputs and outputs are very generic. So when you see project management plan, it includes components such as schedule, baselines, and so on and so forth. Project documents includes change log, requirements, documentation, and so on. Project charter, agreements, and change requests are no longer considered project documents. So they are identified specifically when they are an input or an output. The result of all of this is there are more ITOs, actually. It doesn't look like it when you look at those front pages of the processes because of the genericized, but the specifics are listed in the ITO figure for each process. So you'll see that there's actually more inputs and outputs and tools and techniques listed than there were previously. So for example, there's an example for you for data gathering. There's a lot more listed. So do take a look at the detailed figure for each one of the processes. So we talked about the standard. That was the 5th edition Annex A1. Chapters 1 to 3 have really changed. With the previous chapter 3 is no longer there effectively because it's now the standard, be redundant to the standard. It really talks about the organizational context, gives a little bit more information on governance. There's some interesting discussion about the benefits of project management. So those of you who are trying to argue to your clients, to your executive level about why we need this sort of structured process might point to that first chapter. There's a lot more on the role of the project manager and the competencies of the project manager. So argument about whether that should be in a standard or not. It's hard to standardize competencies, I think, but I'm seeing just everybody and anybody is calling themselves a project manager, and at a certain point, this is very confusing for business. I think it is important to at least capture that somewhere. And the minimum requirements are in the standard, and the PMBOK kind of has this discussion about the role and competencies of the project manager. Curiously enough, that specific paragraph on the role of the project sponsor is no longer in the PMBOK, which for me is a crying shame because I'd like to point to that. But the project sponsor is mentioned a lot more in the actual PMBOK as well as the standard. So that role is embedded in the actual actions of the process. So I guess it's a good compromise. As I mentioned, there's an emphasis on tailoring processes. So there's a section on tailoring, and if you are going to be stuck in that limbo of 2007 writing, whether before March 26th or after, do make sure that you really understand that section. Each knowledge area has a new paragraph, a new clause on trends and emerging practices, which is quite interesting. So it's kind of pushing into the future as opposed to just talking about the past. So again, for those of you who have your PMP, I find it hard to believe that they'll test you on that, but remember those 200 questions, 25 are, the test questions, and so I wouldn't be surprised some of those 25 might indeed talk about some of those trends and emerging practices. And we always say that you might run into language that you've never heard of before in the PMP exam, and some of that language may come from these clauses. It's worthwhile reading, even if you have your PMP and are not interested in studying for the exam. There's consideration for agile practices, whether we like it or not. Folks that are, in construction and kind of been out of the loop with that whole methodology, which I'll admit I have. I keep saying I'm going to catch up with that, take a course in it, never managed. Kevin is shaking his head, I'm sure. Yeah, you will see that in the actual processes in a few places that there has been a tool regarding Agile or an output regarding Agile. You will see a greater emphasis on lessons learned in every single, well, not every single, but a lot of the processes. You will see that emphasis on knowledge in before you start, particularly the planning processes. You will see, it doesn't look like it because it doesn't say lessons learned per se, but when it's a project documents are an input, often what they're referring, well, most of the time is what they're referring to is at least lessons learned from past projects or from a previous phase. So project management competencies, if you haven't heard enough about this, very focused on the PMI talent triangle. There's more discussion about what this means and how we should keep our competencies current. There's also information on ethics and the code of conduct. And of course, that is still something that project manager is supposed to be very familiar with. Some of that is right in the standard, not just in the body of knowledge, but some of that code of conduct information is right in the standard, so you're able to test that. So let's talk about each individual process. How has it changed? Project integration management. Let me show my little arrow. So as I mentioned, new process, manage project knowledge. Main output being the lessons learned register. Business documents as an input to develop project charter. No longer the confusing language of project statement of work and procurement statement of work. So project statement of work is gone. Procurement statement of work is still there. But business documents is supposed to cover whatever you receive as an input to the project process. The PMBOK still considers the development of the business case and the benefits management plan as sort of outside the project life cycle. That doesn't mean that the project manager is unaware of them and is not constantly feeding into them. And you'll see business documents come up in process after process. So much greater awareness on that touch point with the business case and making sure that a project does achieve its benefits. In fact, you will see in the first 3 chapters discussion of 2 key business documents, namely the business case and the benefits management plan. And that's in the first 3 chapters. Interpersonal and team skills. You will see that come up in possibly some unexpected areas, emphasizing that, again, the project manager's competencies. A lot of these processes cannot work without the project manager's interpersonal skills and team skills. And sometimes that's team management skills, and other times it's skills within the team that need to be developed. So a key tool of project management. Organizational process asset updates does not come up as an output as often as it did in the previous PMBOK. You will see it only come up in 2 management execution, one might say, activities, processes rather. So previously we talked about lessons learned as being an output, and that was covered off by organizational process asset updates. But here what it's saying is that organizational process asset updates, i.e. stuff that goes into the company, happens through these integration knowledge areas, direct and managed project work, and manage project knowledge. You will gather lessons learned through all the other processes, but as I mentioned, that's covered under project documents updates, as opposed to the organizational process assets updates. If you want to, don't forget it's also deliverables and so on and so forth. That's also organizational process asset updates that go into the organization. So that's pretty much covered only through these 2 processes and not through the other execution processes or controlling processes. New output out of closed project or phase, final report. So before we only had 2 outputs out of closed project or phase. Now we have this final report as an output of closed project or phase. You will see project charter come up as an input a lot more than it used to. Well, one of the main reasons for that is before project documents covered project charter, and now project charter is not considered just another project document, but actually is a major element of the whole project management process that needs to be used. It's not a stagnant document. Oh, somebody asked what's an ITO? Input, tool, technique, and output. Okay, so we often refer to them as an ITO. I know we all hate acronyms, but gosh, it gets really crowded on a slide if you keep typing that out. So as I mentioned, I'm going to go through some of these groupings of tools and techniques. As I mentioned, there's an appendix at the back of the PMBOK that explains the tools and techniques a little bit deeper. It's also very handy, again, if you're studying for the exam, because it actually shows where the individual tools and techniques are used. So it's very useful for studying for the exam. Again, going back to these groupings of tools and techniques, they are explained further in each process. So here's an example. So for managed project knowledge, what you see as a figure in each process, which makes things a lot easier to understand. Before it was buried in the text and you had to go to the text and read it. Now you can see it as a summary in these process figures. Also great as a checklist when you are either auditing a project or when you are developing a project management framework for your organization to decide, okay, what do they mean by all the tools? Active listening and so on and so forth, political awareness and so on. It's a nice checklist for ourselves to go through. So each one of the processes have these detailed lists under these generic groupings of inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. Scope management. You'll see that, again, that grouping. So I'll dive into some of these in each one of these slides. Hold on a second, I have to move my mouse and move something that's hiding my screen on my computer. Thank you very much. So one of the common groupings is data gathering, for example. So it's interesting to look at this because we had previously seen as tools and techniques things like brainstorming and check sheets and checklists. Unfortunately, that unfortunate language is still there, check sheets and checklists. Statistical sampling and some of these details tools of quality management and so on and so forth. Well, they don't have that in the list of in these process charts anymore, but that doesn't mean that they're gone. So be very careful of that. And again, I'm going to draw your attention to come on. Talk to me, thank you, to a grouping called data analysis, for example. And again, data analysis is another one of those groupings of techniques. Agreements is a common input as well. Again, previously it was handled as a project document. Now it's actually not included as a project document, so is specifically mentioned. Data gathering, already mentioned. So as an example for data analysis, this is the most interesting place where that grouping was done to kind of smooth out the look when you create these figures. But previously under, for example, cost management knowledge area, earned value was specifically mentioned. It is no longer specifically mentioned. Of course, it's mentioned in the figure for the process of control costs, but don't forget earned value analysis as that very important tool of cost management. Just because it's not specifically mentioned in that one pager does not mean it's not very important. Simulations, for example, Monte Carlo analysis, not specifically mentioned. Risk probability impact assessment is an assumption under data analysis. Decision tree analysis, make and buy analysis. Proposal evaluation is a tool and technique under that heading of data analysis. So make sure you understand, particularly the data analysis area, as to the tools and techniques that are used there. Just because they're not mentioned in the overall figure doesn't mean that they weren't actually included as part of the tools and techniques. Schedule management. Meetings comes up a lot. So I had mentioned that interpersonal skills and meetings. Now, interpersonal skills do not come up in schedule management. I don't know if that's a miss or not, but I'll reserve my judgment. But certainly meetings does, and that is new. And it's an important thing to emphasize. Anybody who's ever attended any of my courses knows that I love the yellow sticky exercise, and I love developing schedules with groups of people as opposed to sitting at my desk. As much as I love the computer software tools, and I love developing schedules, it really is, it's like a big puzzle for me, and I enjoy it very much. I recognize the value of doing it with a group, of creating realistic schedules based on team input. And so the PMBOK has put meetings as a tool and technique over and over again in developing the schedule to emphasize that element that it's not, you don't do it in isolation. You don't create a project schedule in isolation. Bottom-up estimating. Estimate activity durations wasn't in there before, which was a bit of a miss. So now they've covered off that gap. They've put it in there. So is basis of estimates. You'll see basis of estimates not just come up in cost management, but in estimate activity durations, estimate activity effort, and finally the estimate resource effort, and I forget the name of the process, to tell you the truth, and the cost management area as well. So it's very important, emphasizing the fact that whenever you're quoting a number, make sure that you also describe where you got the number from, the range of accuracy, the basis on design, particularly important in Agile, of course, when you are doing this sort of parallel development of design and execution, that you are, whenever you're quoting numbers, you should be also explaining the foundation for those numbers and the relationship between the numbers and the development of the design. Notice Agile release planning under develop schedule. So that's a new one reflecting the trends in the Agile methodology. It is now a tool and technique under develop schedule. By the way, driving consistency, what the PMBOK writers did this time, you will notice if the project charter is an input, it is always mentioned first. If the project management plan is an input, it is always mentioned second. Enterprise environmental factors and OPAs are always mentioned last. So there is a sort of driving consistency for the way that they organized the inputs and the outputs for each one of the processes, basically to help navigate the PMBOK. You will notice change requests as an output of almost, I think actually not almost, of every execution and control process here as well. Sorry, I thought I had an arrow there, I don't. Again, previously it was covered under project documents, now reminding people that out of every single one of our execution and control processes, we could have change requests. A little bit of an issue of the way they handled baselines, by the way. I won't get into that because that's a bit contentious, but you may notice that the way that they handled baselines in the control processes is a little bit different for those of you who are studying for the exam and thinking about 2018. Project cost management, not a heck of a lot changed here. It's pretty much similar, again, earned value, new tool and technique, financing, a new tool, so we should be thinking about how we're going to finance our project that is part of our, before we used to look at that as basically part of the sponsor, the executive role, but the now it is driving home again that role delineation study, particularly for really big projects. Sorry. Particularly for really big projects, that a project manager should be aware of where the financing is coming from and how to manage that throughout the process. And cash flow in particular for construction project managers especially, we are responsible for managing the cash flow in a project, and that is part of the financing. Multi-year projects particularly, this reflects the increasing complexity and the increasing size of some of our projects and the global impact of some of our projects. Sustainability, by the way, is mentioned a few times. Not a huge emphasis on that, but it is mentioned a few times. So just be aware of that. That next edition of the PMBOK, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more about sustainability, social, environmental, and so on. So expert judgment comes up a bit. Again, you might notice data analysis, so they mean earned value here. Don't think that it has disappeared. It has definitely not disappeared, but nothing has really changed here in terms of earned value. I'm disappointed to see earned schedule is not as far as I know, has not been mentioned in the PMBOK, but anyway, that's another story. It is in the earned value standard. You will notice that two complete performance index is still in there. I think the expectation is that we are considering that there's a little bit more on to complete, text on to complete performance index. I think project managers, we used to kind of in courses treat that a little bit lightly. I think that we can expect a little more emphasis on that in exams. Project quality management. Funnily enough, as much as the language has changed here, not a huge sea change here. A few more tools and techniques. There is no more process improvement plan mentioned. Not entirely sure why, but it's gone. I guess it's covered. I would suggest that if you are going to improve your process, it's an organizational process asset. It's either covered under OPAs or it's covered under quality management plan. The managed quality, so we no longer have perform quality assurance, we have managed quality instead. I guess the real big difference here is that in the previous editions of the PMBOK, it was really hard to tell the difference between plan quality management, perform quality assurance, and control quality. It was a similar tools and techniques, similar outputs, and you're kind of scratching your head, well, how do you really tell the difference between these processes? You could if you really understood quality management, but if you are new to the whole arena, it was a bit hard to tell the difference. Now it is more obvious. So plan quality management, kind of understand that. That's quality management plan, developing the quality management plan. Managed quality is there is no longer the output of quality metrics, for example. Instead, we're getting test and evaluation documents. And from that, we change the execution of our project. There are change requests which that we decide on whether or not we need to change the quality management plan. Whereas control quality is much more about those metrics, which is the end, at the ending. I always say that managed quality is about before you and during your development of the product of the project, whereas control quality is on the back end. You're getting the product, you're looking at it, you're inspecting it, you're measuring it, you're gathering data, and then you're making decisions based on whether you're meeting your parameters of quality or not. So managed quality, much more proactive process, and control quality is reactive process. Well, now that's a little bit more obvious in the way that they set up these processes and created the language around them. So the tools and techniques are much more proactive, and the tools and techniques of control quality are indeed much more reactive tools and techniques that you do once you've got a product in hand. And notice that under control quality, the input is the deliverables, whereas under managed quality, the input is not the actual deliverables. Control quality, verified deliverables as an output, no longer validated changes, just change requests, so makes it a little bit simpler and easier to understand. Data representation is another common grouping of tools and techniques, and includes all those good things we used to talk about in quality management, like affinity diagrams, mind mapping, flowcharts, and so on and so forth. You will see the same thing in human resource management as well. So human resource management is no longer called human resource management. It's called project resource management. And you will see a project charter as an input. Project charter is an input now to every planning process. That doesn't mean every process that's in the planning process group. It means every planning process. So everywhere where you're producing some sort of plan document, project charter is an input, which was a little bit inconsistent in the previous PMBOK guide. You will see that enterprise environmental factors are an input to acquire resources. Before it was acquire project team, now it's acquire resources. It includes physical resources, not just human resources. So process 9.3 is about all resources required for the project, not just human. Estimate activity resources, forgot the name. Estimate activity resources is what's been moved from time management into the resource management knowledge area. New output of plan resource management is a team charter. I won't get into the details of what all these mean because we don't have the time. Again, basis of the estimates comes up under estimate activity resources, makes a huge amount of sense. So they're aligning with ACE standards as well. Those of you who are interested in that, the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering, who kind of really does a deep dive on costing for projects, both estimating and managing and controlling costs of project, as well as scheduling management for projects. Interpersonal and team skills, of course, comes up. Pre-assignment comes up. Change requests as an output from acquire resources. Project management plan comes out as an output, a longer list out of acquire resources than it was before, actually, when it just said acquire project team as a process. Develop team performance assessments as before, again a longer list here than there was previously. Control resources, new process, so this means all resources. PMBOK has kind of gotten away from saying that all resources working on a project are part of a project team. Actually, it hasn't said that, but there's it seems to be an implication. The language has changed here. It doesn't talk simply, and if you look at the update of the knowledge area, it's no more project team. So the group developing the project, the PMBOK, has decided that previous language that said manage project team implied a limited scope to the teams that the project manager is interested in. So that's why they've changed the language to, first of all, manage team as opposed to manage project team. Namely, a project manager might be interested in the management of other teams, not just the project team. And also that the project manager's responsibility is broader than simply managing the project team, also managing all resources on the project. And I guess that's particularly in construction, where you have contractors, teams. Should we be interested in the management of that contractors team as well? You might argue that yes, we should. So it broadens the scope. So in terms of human resources, the project manager's scope here has been broadened by quite a bit. I also noticed that the language has been smoothed out and been more consistent with regards to use of the term project management team. And some of you who've been in my courses may have heard me say that there is a core project management team quite often that the project manager is in touch with and watches. So there actually is a paragraph, a clause, might be a very short one, but there is language that says, hey, listen, on larger projects, you're going to have a core project management team that is an entity on its own above and beyond the project team. So I'm watching the time here. I'm going to start shortening this up a little bit. Project communications management, not much has changed here. This is one of the few execution processes that actually does have organizational process asset updates as an output, namely that there is information out of here that goes into the organization, presentations, meeting outputs, intellectual property. Project risk management, a new process, implement risk responses, as I mentioned. Agreements as an input to identify risks. Interpersonal and team skills, again, emphasized here. So under risk management, that comes up quite often, that we do not identify risks and perform risk analysis without bringing in the team, and our own facilitation skills are a key part of identifying and managing risks throughout the project life cycle. So it's no longer called control risk, called monitor risk, because we can't control risks. We can only monitor them and react to them. That might be a bit contentious, but anyways, so be it. I have not had time to, there's a new risk management standard, ISO 31500, has also been updated. I've not had the time to download it and see the alignment between the PMBOK risk management approach and ISO 31500 approach. The last edition of 31500 just collected, implement, and monitor risks under this term called treat risks, which I really liked. And actually, I think it also included planned risk responses. So I really liked that because it made things a little bit simpler. But I'm not sure if 31500, the new edition, actually does the same thing or if it aligns with this. I liked it because 31500 is a national standard of Canada, and as such, when in government, in particular, an enterprise level that adopted 31500, and I know the Ontario government certainly looked at that as a touch point, and the federal government certainly did as well. It made it easier at the project level to align with those enterprise standards. So I do not know what the most recent version of 31500 did. Project procurement management. So process missing now, and you'll see that as an output closed procurements. Again, another process that has OPA updates, organizational process asset updates, for those of you who don't like acronyms, as an output. One of the few processes that does that, and of course you're going to be updating your pre-qualification list and so on and so forth. A lot longer list under outputs for planned procurement management. Project stakeholder management, again, not really huge sea change, except that the language was changed. You'll see project charter come up as an input in both planning processes. The language was changed to focus on stakeholder engagement rather than management, as project managers are rarely in a position to manage and control their stakeholders. So that's a quick overview of the changes in the processes. If you're working on your PM frameworks, one thing that I've noticed with organizations, sometimes it happens that they develop project management frameworks and then it stays that way. One should constantly think about, how has my environment changed? How do I need to update those PM frameworks? So if you're in a project management office, you might start thinking about, what of your frameworks needs to be perhaps language-wise or process-wise could be updated in terms of continuous improvement. I hate updates for the sake of updates, but actually for continuous improvements, and the PMBOK has some nuggets of wisdom in it that are worth bringing into new processes from my perspective. Tips for PMP and CAPM exam preparation. Do make sure you don't take any shortcuts. I know the book is bigger, but please make sure you do read it. If you're in that sort of limbo, Appendix X1 summarizes the changes. You might start there and then dive into the process and just read those sections. It's nice to look at the standard to see, because I'll remind you the standard is actually organized by process group as opposed to knowledge area. So it kind of helps you understand the flow. And please do continue. We always said that. Study sections 1, 2, and 3. They have changed substantially. And some say these are the most important to understand how those knowledge areas, processes, and so on actually apply to real projects. Make sure you go through the glossary and truly understand the definitions. That has not changed, and the differences between related concepts like total float and free float. Any questions, concerns? I have about 8 minutes for questions. So please feel free to type or raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. Okay. Where is the best place to start? Should I just reread from the beginning of the PMBOK? Oh gosh, no. The first 3 chapters, do read those first 3 chapters. It's important to understand that whole environment of project management. Do start there. And then go to it depends where you are. If you've taken a PMP course that was based on the 5th edition, I would suggest going to that appendix talking about what has changed. And if you haven't, it's a tough question. It depends on your experience. You might start with the appendix that captures the knowledge areas. What is the intent of each knowledge area? Then I would probably read the introduction to each chapter, I would identify what I'm very familiar with and what I've worked with. Remember, the exam is experience-based, so you should know some of that stuff that is mentioned in the introductory chapter. If all of it is unfamiliar for you, please write the CAPM first. It's cheaper than writing the PMP exam twice. But some of it, about 50%, you're ready, I think, if you read that introductory section, if you if you are familiar with 50% of what it talks about, then I think that you can start saying, okay, this is something that's realistic for me to write. And then start diving into the areas that are unfamiliar to you. Start with those. Okay, so to summarize, depending where you are in your studying process, depending whether you've taken an exam or not, go to the appendices first, go to the first 3 chapters first, go to the introduction first. You'll probably find them easier reading anyways. And then start dealing with the stuff you don't know by specifically going to those clauses. I find it very useful to become a member first and download the electronic copy, because then you can do quick searches. Besides the tool and technique appendix, you can quickly go to brainstorming session. What do they mean by that? Most of us know what brainstorming is all about, so that's probably not something that we need to really read about. But what facilitation techniques are they talking about? And you will be surprised on the facilitation techniques, they'll mention a whole list of stuff there that you should be familiar with. And not all of us have used all those facilitation techniques, so make sure you read those. So start with what you know, build up your confidence, and then start closing off the gaps with what you don't know. That's how I would start. Anything else? Any other questions? So I don't see any other questions. I don't see any other chats. I see a lot of people have gone back to work, so I'm going to say ciao for now, and hope to see you in some of our courses. We'll talk to you soon, and have a great project management life. Enjoy your projects. Goodbye.